Fruit tree pruning is a fairly complicated subject and really super difficult to do virtually. So I'm going to try my hardest. However, I do have some resources I also want to provide for you folks that I think might be helpful in helping you to navigate fruit tree pruning. And Sean, I might ask if it's possible just in the chat, if you could populate. I have a blog that I run. It's called organicforecast.org. There's no www, it's just organicforecast.org. And I did populate in that blog this morning you look at, it's the first blog when you go there. Some really nice videos that cover fruit tree pruning. It shows you step by step and really helps you to kind of break down, you know, the different steps of it, of pome fruits. So apples and pears, stone fruits, peaches, nectarines, and as well as raspberries and grapes. And so I think that those videos are really going to help. A lot of the step-by-step instructions are really going to help folks a lot as you go out into your garden and attempt to do this. But we will cover the basics today. Just know that those are some resources that are available to you that I think are going to be really helpful. Okay, without further ado, let me go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint.
Katie, that was organicforecast.org.
Yes.
Okay,
There's
cool.
no www, it's just organicforecast.org.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so let's go to, and Sean, before you leave us, I just want to make sure that my screen is showing and it's advancing.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Okay, then we're ready to rock and roll. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about fruit tree pruning. And some of these we went through with the previous lecture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I'll go through them very quickly just because I feel like we covered those with the previous lecture a little bit. We can spend more time on some of the stuff that's really specific to fruit trees. But some different reasons why we prune. Tree health is really important. Removing anything that's dead, diseased, or dying. We call them the 3Ds or triple D. Those need to come out of the tree. That is at any time of the year. When you see it, you remove it. It's really important. This is a really nice picture to show here. This looks like it is probably an apple tree, I would guess. And this is a bacterial disease that we oftentimes see in apple and pear trees called fire blight. Maybe some of you have seen this before. This is a potentially fatal disease for the tree. It enters through the blossoms of the tree typically during the right weather conditions. The vector is insects or splashing water. And this is one that we actually have to look out for and prune out of trees. It's pretty prevalent here in Utah, especially certain years when we have just the right weather conditions. So you got to take care of this. You've got to manage these trees. You got to have to constantly be looking for insect and disease pressures and taking care of those. And so just wanted to kind of point that out. And then another thing I was just going to ask Sean to populate, we talked about this in the last session too, but if we have some new folks, if you would just put the utahpests.usu.edu site in chat or wherever you're putting those, utahpests.usu.edu. That is our go-to with the extension service of helping you know how to recognize insect and disease pressures and how to manage and control them. So certainly the tree health is an important part for pruning. We talked about this last time in the last lecture as well, directing growth. So getting your desired shape and form. I did kind of tell the folks in the last session that fruit trees are kind of the exception to the rule. A lot of our landscape trees and shrubs, we are not necessarily doing pruning on them unless there's a desired purpose that we're trying to get out of it, and we're not heavily pruning those types of plants typically to force them into a form or a size that is not that they don't genetically they're not genetically dispositioned to be just in themselves based on their plant genetics. Fruit trees are different. So I guess I want to do as a caveat just in the very beginning here, and this is really important message because I think this is something a lot of people get tripped up on. You don't have to prune your fruit trees. It's your choice. If you have a apple tree in your backyard that is 30 feet tall and 20 feet wide, and you want it to be a nice shade tree, you like the look of it, that's fine. That apple tree can be a shade tree. What we're talking about today is specifically for fruit production and for maximizing fruit production. You may decide with your fruit trees and your landscapes that that's not your priority, and that's fine. So just realize that you always have a choice with that. You don't have to prune, but this talk today is to help to train you how you can prune if you're trying to achieve maximum fruit production. Also, we prune very heavily fruit trees, and we'll talk more obviously as we go along about how we do that very, very heavily. And when we do prune, those are wounds or injuries to that plant. It is stressful to that plant. And so as we're doing these heavy pruning annually on these trees, we are stressing them. And so the life of a fruit tree is not, that's being pruned for fruit production, is not typically very long. We may be looking at having a fully productive fruit tree in the landscape for maybe 30, 35, 40 years. And then we're cutting it down and planting a new one and starting over. So keep that in mind as well. So we want to direct growth. We're going to talk a lot about this in detail in just a minute to get the desired shape and form, and then renew, bloom, and vegetative growth as well. Okay, absolutely essential with fruit trees. And actually, this doesn't have anything to do with pruning, but it has to be said. Fruit trees need 10 to 12 hours of direct sunlight daily. They need light, big time, for fruit production. If you're trying to grow a fruit tree in a spot that is not getting adequate sunlight, sun exposure, you're going to have problems with that tree. So making sure first that we're placing that tree where it can get that amount of light is really, really important. Light is what creates the fruit buds in the tree. So you're not going to get fruit production if you don't have light exposure to those buds. So you absolutely need light to create those blossoms. We actually need about 30% of the light actually being exposed to those blossoms to get basically the full photosynthesis potential. And we need lots and lots of photosynthesis to, of course, create our fruit production. So lots and lots of light in the canopy of the tree. When do we prune? Well, so with fruit trees, we typically prune during the dormant period. There is some summer pruning that takes place with fruit trees. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the dormant period is right about now. So I would say February, no later than late April. Although you probably should be doing fruit tree pruning more February, March would be kind of the best time of year to be doing this. A very easy visualization of the tree, which is super duper important because with fruit production, we're really doing a lot of pruning for form and shape. Also, we talked about it last time, but there's a lot less insect pests and diseases kind of floating around. So as we prune, we're creating wounds on that plant. It gives that plant a chance to compartmentalize or seal over that wound, that cut, so that it lends it less susceptible for insect and disease attack. And our dormant cuts also are stimulating new growth in the trees. And we're going to talk about this in more detail, so I don't want to go into this too much right now. But that's another reason why we're pruning during the dormant period. The summer pruning that I'm referring to is for our stone fruits. So that would be, in particular, peaches and nectarines. And we'll take a closer look at this, but we do have a nice picture here of a peach orchard. And you can see that these peach trees have been pruned to what we call this open vase or this open center form, where basically we have these main scaffolds that are kind of originating from a whorl from the trunk, and they are moving outwards. They're not competing with one another. We're constantly making our pruning cuts, and so we're pushing these branches so that they're going outwards. This is how we're going to get maximum light exposure. And so any summer pruning would be, if anybody has peach or nectarine trees, you know this, that they put on a lot of vigorous vegetative growth throughout the growing season. So they're growing a lot of branches and leaves, basically. And they will try to grow those branches and leaves back into the center of this plant. So that is an example of some summer pruning that we would do, that any growth that's emerging back, that's trying to grow back into the center of this plant, we would prune that out in the summertime. Or I'll show you in a second, pick those off as water sprouts with our fingers as we start to see those emerge on those trees. Okay, so again, with this summer pruning, we talked about this with peaches and nectarines. We do this, it's really important so that we get good sun exposure to the fruit. That is going to help to color the fruit. It's also going to increase the sugar content in the fruit. And that's what's going to lend us to have our nice sweet peach. So we actually increase the quality of the fruit as well. We get increased air circulation in the canopy of the tree. This is going to help us sometimes to avoid having some disease that we see sometimes that happen when we have a lot of foliage in the canopy of the tree. So this is the summer pruning. Again, this is with our peaches and our nectarines. Okay, we're going to go over some simple terminology here. We talked about this last time, so I'll move quickly through it. In the center, we have what's called our leader, okay, our central leader. This is the main trunk or trunks. We have our scaffolds that come off of the central leader. And so these are our branches that are coming out. This is really important with fruit tree production because this is where the fruit is going to be produced in the tree. Water sprouts, a lot of times people call these suckers. If we have this upward growth, this vertical growth that's happening in the canopy of the tree, the technical term for it is a water sprout. This is really important for fruit production, that water sprouts tend to grow leaves. They do not bear fruit. So they are doing absolutely nothing for you from a fruit production standpoint, okay? So it's something that we oftentimes just eliminate in tree fruit production because they're shading the tree, right? They're producing those leaves that's shading different portions of the tree that we obviously don't want the shading because that's going to decrease our light penetration into the tree. And they're not bearing fruit for us. So in fruit production, we eliminate water sprouts completely. Suckers are vertical shoots that arise from the root of the plant. We do see a lot of suckering in fruit trees. I don't know if anybody has an older apple tree. In particular, if you have like an apple tree that's like, 30, 40 years old, pretty much the only growth it puts on is suckers and water sprouts from year to year. So it's very common that we see these in fruit trees. We do prune these trees heavily. It is a sign of stress, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing anything wrong. It's just kind of part of the process of fruit production. And then spurs. And spurs are what we're going to find in our pome fruits. So pome are our apples and our pears. And these are kind of these short condensed stems. They kind of look a little bit like thorns. They're real small and they're almost kind of stubby looking. And this is where the fruit is produced on apples and pears, okay? You can see that this particular spur that you're looking at is a 5-year-old spur. Oops, sorry about that. You can see the old leaf scars from previous years. So we have 1, 2, my mouse isn't working real well, 3, 4, and then this is the 5th year growth of this spur. These spurs typically are not productive. They don't start bearing fruit until they're at least 2 years old. About 2 to 4 years old is how old these spurs need to be before they're going to start bearing fruit. So really important on apples and pears, learn to identify fruiting spurs and don't prune them off because they take a really long time to grow back. And they will stay productive for many years if you do take care of them. So fruiting spurs as well. Peaches and nectarines, we'll take a look at this in a minute, but They're different. They do not bear on fruiting spurs. They bear fruit on year-old wood, so last year's wood. If you look at the canopy of a peach or a nectarine, you kind of have that orangey kind of a cast or coloration to that year-old wood, and that is where the peaches and nectarines are going to bear on that tree. So again, apples and pears and apricots and cherries will all produce spurs. Cherries and apricots also will bear fruit on year-old wood, but they also do produce some spurs too. So very important to be able to recognize that in those pome fruits. Okay, so we have to identify when we think about how we're going to properly prune your fruit trees, what the plant is, what is your desired goal out of that plant. Is this going to be a landscape specimen tree, or are you maximizing fruit production? Very important consideration to think about. How does it grow, and what the function of the plant is. So, you know, if you have a peach tree in your landscape, for example, you need to make that decision right up front and center of, do you want this peach tree to get to be 30 feet tall in the landscape, or do you want to try to maintain it at 10 feet? Typically, we would say with newly planted trees and shrubs that you plant them, maybe not doing a lot of pruning on them initially. You're kind of letting them settle into their new home, put on root growth, establish themselves in the landscape before we're really worried about coming in and doing a lot of pruning and directed growth on those specimens. Completely different with fruit trees. We prune fruit trees right out the door. Let me tell you, actually, in a commercial orchard, I want to go back to this picture actually, because I think this will help you guys see this a little bit better. These peach trees were initially planted as saplings, okay? And so they were just like single twigs. And immediately what happened is this orchard manager came along and they they did a heading cut to these peach trees at about 36 inches up, so about three feet up. And what happened with that heading cut, for those of you that went to the previous lecture, is we got this kind of flush of, we had a lot of these latent buds that broke dormancy right underneath where that heading cut was made, okay? The orchard manager then selected these 3 to 4 main scaffolds, so these main branches coming out, to select for the ones that they wanted to maintain for fruit production. They were looking for scaffolds that were not going to compete with one another. They were growing at different directions from one another so that they could form this nice open bowl or vase shaped growing pattern. And then from there, again, selective pruning cuts to maintain this form in which these main scaffolds are growing out and away from one another for maximum light production throughout the canopy of that tree, leaving that the open, or the middle part of that tree open. So that pruning happened, probably that initial pruning of cutting off that sapling happened that same year that sapling was planted. That is how commercial orchards would do it. I do find, though, most homeowners are probably not going to do that. That takes a lot of guts, actually, for some people to make that initial cut to head off the top and to start that shaping process. So if you are going, for example, to a nursery and you're selecting a fruit tree that you want to plant in your yard, you're probably looking at a tree at that point in time that's maybe like 2 or 3 years old. It's probably containerized. So what I would suggest for you is, as you're selecting that plant, that you look for plants that have scaffolds already growing in the correct locations that you desire, have a good form and shape, so that when you plant them in your landscape, you already have kind of started that process of having that appropriate shape and form of that tree. So be selective, I guess is what I'm saying. Don't just buy the tallest fruit tree that they have or whatever. Make sure that you have the right direction directional growth of those scaffolds as branches so that you're kind of successful right out the gate. And you are going to start actually pruning that tree when you plant it, that same year you plant it. And I'll go over some of those pruning forms with you here in a minute. So very different for fruit trees. Okay, some different pruning tools that we have. One that's really important is your hands. We talked about this last class, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But since we do get so much suckering and water sprouting on fruit trees in particular, as those first start to emerge, if you can find them and you can rub them off or pick them off, that's a great way to remove them. It's actually a lot healthier for the tree too, because then you don't have to make a cut and create a wound by cutting them off with a pair of hand shears later. So kind of constantly monitoring those trees, looking for those and rubbing or picking those off as you see them. And can be great for pest removal as well. Okay, I'm going to just absolutely breeze through this because we talked about this last time, but some pruning tools, bypass pruners. We do recommend bypass pruners as opposed to these anvil pruners. Bypass pruners have the two blades. They're going to make a nice cleaner cut. You want to keep them sharp. You want to keep them clean. Steel wool. If you have anything gummy on them, you can use a little rubbing alcohol to get that off. But nice sharp pair of bypass pruners. I don't have a recommended brand, but you get what you pay for. So spend a little money on your bypass pruners. These are going to be for anything that's ½ inch in diameter down. We said last class, if you're sweating or swearing, you're using the wrong tool. You need to upgrade to the next tool, okay? So this is for smaller size branches. Loppers. So again, we recommend this bypass blade. These are for branches that are about 1.5 inches diameter and down, okay? So kind of smaller, or sorry, larger branches on these guys, and long enough to handle and reach. Loppers are really great for if we're trying to do pruning in the upper portions, especially those that are vertically challenged like me. Upper portions of the canopy, these can really help you get up there and reach. So it should be a tool that you can lift over your head and is manageable and comfortable for you to cut above your head. Pruning saw. One of my favorite tools. I like these curved ones like this. You find straight ones too. I recommend you look for a curved blade like this one has here in the picture. This is one I think you can go a little bit less expensive with these guys because they're very, very difficult to sharpen. So once they kind of get dull, give it away, throw it away, whatever you're going to do with it. Go ahead and purchase a new one. So you don't have to spend as much on quality for this one. Okay, and you have a nice push and pull action. This can be used for larger size branches. And you just want to make sure that you keep them sharp and clean, or just replace them as you need to. Okay, so it's really important in fruit tree production that you understand and are able to recognize where fruit is produced. And we already looked at this. This is a fruiting spur. Again, we're finding this in primarily apples and pears, but we also sometimes see these in cherries and apricots. And again, they have to be at least 2 years old or older to bear fruit. So if you have a very young tree and you have fruiting spurs and they're not producing fruit, be patient because I bet next year you're going to start to see some fruit production on them. Okay, this is what the 1-year-old wood of peach and nectarine, our stone fruits, looks like. The two fatter buds on the outside are where the fruit is produced. So we would have 2 peaches or nectarines right here, and kind of this more slender bud in the middle is a leaf bud. Apricots, again, can produce fruit on 1-year-old wood or on older spurs. And that's kind of what they look like. They're a little bit longer than we have with the apples and pears. And then cherry can be produced on 2-year-old wood and older spurs. And with cherries, we get kind of this whorled sort of arrangement of buds on cherries. So very, very important that you are able to recognize where the fruit is going to be produced on the tree Why do you need to recognize that? Well, you need to make sure that those buds are receiving adequate light exposure. Light, you get good light penetration getting to those buds. Remember, at least 30% of the sunlight coming in needs to be reaching those buds for fruit production. You also need to be conscientious of that as you're pruning to make sure that you're not pruning off wanted fruit. A lot of those different types of considerations in recognizing where the fruit is being produced on the tree. Okay, this is absolutely essential. You need light in the canopy, and if you think about an unpruned canopy, if you just allow the genetics of that plant to do what they're going to do without any pruning, you're in essence going to have a shade tree. And if you think about what that means on a plant is that you have your sun exposure, that the top portion of that tree, the upper portions of that canopy are what are going to receive the maximum sun exposure. As you move your way down throughout the canopy of that tree, you're going to get less sun exposure and much less sun exposure here at the bottom portions of the tree. So what we're trying to do when we prune fruit trees is we're trying to sort of break this up so that we have good light penetration, sun exposure all the way through the canopy of this tree. And so that's why we're shaping the tree the way that we are, is really to get that light exposure, okay? Again, you need 30% light for flower bud formation. And so the tree shape is really important. So for example, with like apples and pears, we are trying to prune the tree to achieve more of a kind of a pyramid shape to that canopy so that we have good sun exposure all the way down through the top, middle, and lower scaffolds of the tree, so we have good fruit production all the way through the tree. Okay, so that's kind of what you're thinking about. We'll go over specifics in terms of step-by-step of how you select scaffolds, how you prune those, and that sort of thing. But I want you to keep in mind generally the shape or the form of the tree that we're kind of going for. An apple or a pear tree does not want to grow like this naturally, okay? It wants to grow like that. So that's why we prune so heavily, so we can get it more to this shape or form. Okay, so there's our sun exposure. All right. Branch angle is really important as well. We already talked about water sprouts in the canopy of the tree, that if the growth is vertical, if it's going straight up, it tends to be vegetative and not doesn't put on fruit. Okay, so vegetative means it will grow leaves but not fruit. So water sprouts in our tree is not desirable, and our canopy is not desirable because it's going to be shading some of those fruit buds, and we of course don't want that because we want good light exposure, and it's not going to bear fruit for us. Okay. On the flip side, if you have a branch that is angled horizontally, it tends to be productive, so it bears fruit, but it doesn't tend to be vegetative. It doesn't really have too many leaves. So there's kind of this this happy medium where we need both, right? We need our leaves because they have to photosynthesize for us so that we can have good fruit production, but we also want to make sure that we have the branch angle, that we're not just bearing leaves and not fruit. So what we're looking for is about a 30 to 45 degree angle is really best. And I'll show you in a minute a few strategies for training branches to do this for us. Okay, so here they have one that they're guiding a branch here, or actually it looks like they're guiding a scaffold off of that leader. You can see this is the leader here and the scaffold here, that they're using a construction shim, actually, that they have tied in between, and they've cut out a little groove as well, so it fits right up against those two main branches to kind of help, again, to get that 30 to 45 degree angle above the horizon. Okay, this is a technique for trying to train larger branches. Ideally, we would want to train the branches when they're younger, though, and I'm going to show you a couple techniques for that as well. Another important thing for our branch angles is just that a wider crotch angle is going to be able to support heavier loads. And that's pretty obvious why that's important, especially when we're talking about things like apples and pears and peaches and nectarines, are really pretty heavy, large sized fruits. And so if we have a really narrow crotch angle, it tends to be pretty weak. We get a lot of branch breaking under the weight of that fruit. Having that wider angle is going to help us to support those heavier fruit loads. So here are a few techniques. I've used this one before. I don't drill into my trees, and I don't think you need to, but you don't necessarily need to do an eye hook, but you can do a wrap technique. You could, use a twist tie or something like that, and then a string off of that, anchored down with some sort of a support. It might be a landscape staple, or I've used rocks before, actually down here to kind of weigh it down. But that's one technique for pushing those scaffolds down again to that 35 to 40 degree angle. Okay, here's a use of a shim. This is probably a little bit more appropriate here. Like I said, you should be working on training your scaffolds when they are really quite young, and they've used a shim here on a younger one. You can see that V groove that's been notched out of both ends of it to push that scaffold, that desired scaffold, away from the main branch. You can use clothespins. Clothespins are really easy to use, and they work really well too, especially with apples. And you can see that they actually put this clothespin up above this what will now be our scaffold, our desired scaffold here. And it physically being up above makes it so that that branch can't grow up, right? Because the clothespin is there. It's obstructing its ability to grow upwards. Or if you're doing some sort of an espalier or something like that, a trellis, something like that is another technique for the training. I'm not going to talk specifically about espalier because, to be honest with you, I'm happy to answer it in Q&A questions about it, but we have so much material to get through today. I want to make sure we get through that first and get those questions out of the way before we kind of get into some of these special forms. Okay, we talked about this in the last class, some different strategies for pruning. And one is a heading cut. And I'm going to get caught up in my notes here a little bit. So make sure I'm not leaving anything out. Okay, heading cut is used to tip the end of a branch. We talked about this last time for those of you that were there. And what we typically get with heading cuts is we get this flush of growth that happens just below where that heading cut was made. So like here, a heading cut was made here, so we get the flush of growth just below. Heading cut was here, and a flush of growth just below this branch immersion. It's just controlled by hormones in the plant, okay? When we're doing heading cuts, we want to make sure that we are cutting back to a bud that has the direction of desired growth that we would like to see that branch to move that bud, okay? So that's the general principle of a heading cut. Now, we don't really do heading cuts very often in apples and pears. Pome fruits. Why? Think about that. Why wouldn't I do a heading cut? Big flush of growth right at the tip. Well, if I have growth that's being generated out of the tip, then I have potential shading that's going to be happening to the interior portions of that tree, and that's not what we're going to desire for fruit production, okay? Where we do utilize heading cuts is in peaches and nectarines and our stone fruits. And we do this because we want to shorten the branches. And the reason why we want to shorten the branches is because we need to have a branch that is an adequate diameter on the tree to be able to handle the weight of that peach and nectarine. It's going to need to be probably about the thickness of a pencil, or it's not going to be able to handle that weight. So that is when we would utilize a heading cut to shorten those year-old wood, those branches on the peach tree, to be able to handle the weight of those peaches and nectarines that bear on that tree. Again, we're not going to use this technique very often, or if all, on apples and pears or cherries. We talked about this last time, so I'm not going to go into it. This is topping. We don't recommend this. But let's move on to fruit production. Okay. Thinning cut. Now, thinning cut is something that we would use more often in apples and pears. And this is where we're taking a branch back to its point of origin. Okay. So kind of going over some of these different pruning cuts. And then I'm going to pull it all back together in terms of what this all means in terms of when you're pruning your fruit trees, what your desired form should look like for your different types of fruit. Okay, so we are going there. I just want to make everybody know that I'm moving that direction, but we have to talk about cuts first, okay? So thinning cut, you're taking it back to its point of origin. The difference between a heading cut and a thinning cut is that with a heading cut, we're taking it back to a bud. We're going to have a lot of buds breaking dormancy just under that heading cut. Here with this thinning cut, we don't see the same thing. The response is that the branch won't grow back, and what the plant will actually do is it will start throwing more growth into the branches that were not cut back to the point of origin. I'm trying to get my mouse to work here. So it's going to start throwing more growth this way towards this branch now that this one is gone. Okay, so again, this is how we can get some of our directional growth in our plants. And we talked about this in the last class. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if we are taking off a larger size branch, now really in tree fruit production, unless we are dealing with a fruit tree that has been neglected and we're trying to regenerate it, we really should not be probably taking off really large size branches since we're doing so much of that directional pruning in the early life of the tree. However, I know there are people attending today that have very large fruit trees in their yards, or they know somebody who does, and they want to know if they can prune those back to kind of more of the structure and form that we're discussing today. I would say this, it's difficult, and it's kind of tree by tree. It's somewhat possible. If it is a really, really large tree and an old tree, it's going to be very difficult. The first thing you should probably focus on if you're in that situation is height reduction, okay? You want to try to get that height down. That's probably not going to happen in a single year, okay? That might be strategized over many years. But in that, you are probably, most definitely, especially in older trees, going to cause a lot of water sprouting in that tree by taking a lot of that height out of that tree, trying to reduce it in size. And so you're going to generate a lot of additional growth as you're trying to remove those upper portions of the tree. So it can be a little bit of an uphill battle. And I'm not saying don't do it and it's not possible. Just realize it's a lot harder with mature fruit trees that have kind of, have gotten out of control that you're trying to bring back down. It's a lot easier to prune a young tree from the beginning and to form it to get the desired shape that you want for fruit production. So I will probably leave it at that for right now, but I know there's going to be questions about that from some of you that have certain types of trees. In that situation, I'm more than happy to address those. I'll try to leave time at the end for that. Okay, but again, you don't have to prune your tree. If that's your situation and you have a fruit tree that you really like the look of it and it's gotten out of control and it's just going to be an uphill battle trying to prune that back down to kind of the shape and form I'm talking about, you have the choice not to prune it, okay? So that's just kind of a decision that you have to make. But for these larger branches, we're going to cut them at the branch collar. It's a more natural looking branch. And then this is what we're trying to avoid. We talked about this in the last class, so I'll go over this very quickly. Was this tearing of the bark. And the way that we avoid that is we do the 3-cut system. Cut number 1 is about 6 to 12 inches away from the trunk of the tree. We cut from the bottom portion of the limb up. We go about halfway through, okay? And we stop at that point. Our cut 2, we move out from that cut 1 and we make a cut starting up above. This is to remove this weight of this limb that's protruding out, just to physically get that weight off. If it does start tearing, you can see this tried to start tearing here. It's going to stop where you made that cut one, so you're not going to get this ripping or tearing action down the trunk. And then our cut 3 is our cut that we make between the trunk and the branch. We're making that cut outside of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar, which is kind of a natural swelling point. It's the transition of trunk to branch in the tree. And so it enables the tree to compartmentalize off and actually and eventually kind of grow over that wound, that prune. Eventually you wouldn't even see it. It would be completely encased in cork cambium. So basically it would turn into bark and you wouldn't see it down the road. So anyway, this is just that picture of that. I know we talked about this last time, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is the incorrect cut. This is what we would call a flush cut. We would be cutting into the branch bark ridge and branch collar this way. Oops, sorry about that. This is the correct cut here, where it is outside the branch bark ridge, which is here. It's outside, or sorry, the ridge is here, the branch collar is here. It's outside. It's kind of this angled cut upward, and that's what's healthiest for the tree. I know there was the question last time, if this does happen to you, if you have something like this happen, is there anything you can do? You really can't. You could clean it up a little bit, but you should never put anything on it. And I did mention last class, there are wound sealers that are sold. Don't use them, okay? Just leave it alone. Let the plant, let the tree try to compartmentalize that damage on its own. And that's really the best that you can do at that point in time.
Hey,
Okay.
Katie.
Yes.
There's a question in the chat that kind of goes along with what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
I think some people see pruning as intimidating. I think it can be for a lot of people. What is your advice for people that think it's intimidating or are worried about mistakes that they might make while pruning, things like that?
Yeah, so, I mean, certainly you are going to make mistakes and that's part of the learning process. And I hope that people just kind of accept that there is a learning process. Also, there's no one way to correctly prune a single fruit tree. You have to make a series of decisions as you're pruning to say, I'm going to keep this, I'm going to leave this. Somebody else might come along and say, no, I think I'm going to keep that one and leave that one actually. So people can prune different ways. It's a little bit subjective. I would say try to follow these guiding principles, right? But don't beat yourself up. And actually, fruit trees are very forgivable. They will grow. The only cut that you can really make that you can't go back on is the one that you make at the base of the trunk, right at the soil line, right? That's the only one you really can't go back on. Other than that, be okay making mistakes, and your trees will continue to grow, and just work with them, and it's okay. It's okay. Don't be too intimidated by it. Okay. Does that help? It's kind of like a haircut. You can have a really bad haircut, but it will grow back and you have the opportunity to cut it again. Okay. Yep. So that's kind of how I look at fruit trees.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So we're going to just absolutely breeze through this, but this is kind of your selection process of what to prune first. And as you kind of move through those pruning decisions, the first thing you want to do with your fruit tree is anything that you see is dead, diseased, or dying, that goes first. That has to come out of the tree, okay? So we go ahead and we remove anything like that, okay? Especially some of you that have older fruit trees might have some dead branches and things like that. Those are always the first to go, so prune those first. And that can happen any time of year. Anything that's diseased or dying, let's get that out of the tree. And, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but don't leave it in your landscape either. Put it in a garbage bag, put it in the trash, throw it away. You don't want to drop those branches and leave them underneath your tree. Okay, so get rid of anything that is diseased or dying. Anything that's broken, let's get that out of there too. Any broken branches, those go next. Okay. Anything that is crossing or rubbing, anything that will be crossing or rubbing. We get this a lot in fruit trees, that the branches may not be crossing or rubbing yet, but they're like located a quarter of an inch away from each other. They will eventually. So you have to make a decision about which one you want to keep and which one you want to leave. Okay. Those can go. It will create problems later if you don't rectify it. Okay, now we're thinking about our pruning decisions as they relate to light exposure. So remember, on the top of the canopy, we're getting 60 to 100% full sun. The middle portion, we're getting 30 to 60% full sun. 30 is what we need for fruit production. And the lower portion, for these unpruned trees, we're getting 0 to 30% sun. So we're probably not getting any or not much fruit in the lower portion of the tree. So you want to stand back and you want to look at that tree and look how the light is filtering through the canopy of the tree and say, how can I get more light in the middle of the tree? We talked about with the apples and pears, remember, we're maybe trying to get less of this rounded canopy and get it into more of kind of a pyramid shape. Is it enough light? And so there's something called the soccer ball test. And that's basically if you want to make sure that your scaffolds, and again, I'll show you what these forms look like for these different types of tree here in a minute. I promise I'll give you something a little bit more visual to look at. But the soccer ball test is if you were to kick a soccer ball, you should be able to kick that soccer ball in between two scaffolds without the soccer ball hitting either of the scaffolds, right? You should have at least that much clearance between those two scaffolds, between those two branches, to clear a soccer ball. So again, you're looking for these pockets of light to generate or penetrate into the interior portions, the interior canopy of that tree, so you can get the sun, you can get the fruit production. Anything that is a water sprout or a sucker, I think we've already talked about this. It goes, right? So this is a pretty easy decision before you're getting into some of the harder decisions with pruning. If it's a water sprout or it's a sucker, I'm immediately going to prune this out. I find when I annually prune fruit trees, that's, you know, obviously dead, disease, or dying, all those things, I take care of those first. This is next for me. This is a really easy decision. If it's a water sprout, it's gone. I'm going to go ahead and prune that out. So you can go ahead and remove all of those, and then you can stand back again and look at the tree, and the tree is going to look really different. And I think that some of those decisions about what you prune and what you keep from that, it makes it a lot easier because you don't have all of those extra water sprouts kind of making it difficult to visualize the main scaffolds that you're looking at and making those decisions on, okay? They do not produce fruit. Okay, and anything odd or out of place. Okay, clean up any cuts that don't look like. If you have some stubs, things like that, you can go ahead and clean those up. Now we've gotten rid of all that stuff. Dead, disease, dying, or 3Ds, right? Stubs, out of place, our water sprouts, our suckers. Now we have some decisions about how we want to prune to get the forms of the trees that we're looking for. Let me catch up on my notes a little bit. For apples and pears and cherries, we have two decisions, but usually in residential landscapes, it just comes down to one. That is the central leader or the modified central leader. Typically, what we're going to select for is the modified central leader. And the reason for this is because it's height control. And, you know, we're not working with a lot of tall equipment. We're not on tractors. We're not those sorts of things like sometimes commercial orchards have. We are working off of, you know, maybe some tree fruit ladders and things like that. And we're just working with our tools, our loppers, our hand shears, our hand saws, things like that. So we really want the growth to be right in front of our face, much more manageable for us. So we're usually looking for this modified central leader, again, for apples, pears, and cherries. The only difference between the modified central leader and the central leader is just if I were to come along on this central leader and I were to make a cut right there and to do a thinning cut right here on that top the top portion of that main leader, then I would now have a modified central leader. Okay. We want to have, give me just a second here. With our apples and our pears and our cherries, we want to, and we have to determine this, how far off the ground we want to start the first set of our main scaffolds, okay? And part of this might be a management decision as well. Maybe if this fruit tree is growing in a lawn area and I have to be able to clear a lawnmower underneath this tree, and that's going to be a little bit of a decision of how far up these branches need to be so that I'm not banging into them every time I'm trying to move a lawnmower through. Or there could be other decisions too. But this really should not be that far off. Your scaffold should not start that far away from your soil line, your first set of scaffolds. So you're looking at about 3 to 4 main scaffolds that are roughly, although it depends on what's available, obviously, as you're buying a tree from the nursery that's containerized and older. But you're looking for something that's maybe 3 to 4, 36 inches, 36 to 48 inches. Your first set of main scaffolds coming off at that point, 36 to 48 inches off of the soil line here. And you're looking for 3 to 4 main scaffolds kind of originating. It's nice that they can be spread out a little bit from one another, but not real far. And what's really important is the scaffolds should be growing different directions from one another. So again, that makes sense. They're exploring different sides, right? They're getting sunlight from different angles. And so you want to have them definitely moving away from one another so they can all have sort of maximum light exposure. So that's our first set of 3 to 4 main scaffolds. Then we want and this is not the best picture, and I apologize for that, but you want about a 2 to 3 foot separation between our next set of main scaffolds. Again, 3 to 4 main scaffolds right below where we have made that cut to create that modified central leader. We had cut off that the top of that main leader. So 2 to 3 main scaffold, or 3 to 4 main scaffolds, doing the same thing where they are originating more or less, a little bit of difference, height difference between them, but they're originating out of a central point. And again, just the really, really important thing is they're exploring different sections, or they're going different directions. They're not competing with one another for sunlight. So I probably made that way more confusing than it needed to be, but soil line, whatever you can get, whatever you need for your management purposes, whatever you can find in the nursery, but roughly about 36 to 48 inches. First set of main scaffolds, 3 to 4 main scaffolds, exploring different directions, fairly close to one another on the trunk, 2 to 3 feet of separation. Second set of 3 to 4 main scaffolds, again, exploring different directions for good light exposure of all the scaffolds. And so you can see the soccer ball test. If I were to kick a soccer ball, I can clear in between these 2 sets of scaffolds. I have my 2 to 3 feet. I have clearance for that soccer ball to move through. So that's a modified central leader. That's what we're looking at for apples, pears, and cherries. And you can kind of see how with those pruning decisions that we have gotten a little bit more of that pyramid shape to that tree, okay, as opposed to sort of that rounded canopy. Okay, vase or multiple leader is here, and these are our stone fruits. These are our peaches, our nectarines, our plums. They can be our apricots. Apricots tend to get pretty big, so we try to control growth on apricots, but sometimes they really just kind of get away from us. But you can certainly try to maintain them to this vase or multiple leader. And with this one, it's kind of similar to the central leader in that you're coming up roughly about 36 to 48 inches above the soil line. And then we don't have a central leader at this point in time. It has been removed, okay? And we looked at that picture earlier in the presentation of that peach orchard. Now we find 3 to 4 main scaffolds to grow again at this 36 to 48 degree angle out and away from that central point, exploring different directions. Okay, so maximum light exposure going out different directions. That's our vase for multiple leader. Okay, do we have questions on that at this point? And I'm happy to talk more about this with Q&A as well.
Let's see. It's maybe not directly related, but can plums be lumped together with peaches and nectarines on how you prune them?
Yeah, plums do well in this vase or multiple leader.
Okay. Let's see. I have 5-year-old apple trees last year that had pests, so they were inedible. What can I use to prevent that?
Yeah, okay. So I can't tell you what your pest was based on a verbal description. That would be really good Q&A stuff. Probably codling moth. You definitely need to visit utahpests.usu.edu. They have a nice section there on apples, and it talks about the common pests and diseases of apples. You will definitely want to familiarize yourself of what those common pests and diseases are of apples, and what you can do to control them. And the controls are different for the different pests and disease. I wish there was just a blanket that this is, hey, you can put this on at this time of year and you're good to go for everything. And that's just not how it works in the fruit production world. You know, I do want to just say too, and it's not that I want to discourage anybody. I think, you know, people should grow fruit. They should do fruit production. It's fun. It's challenging. You probably are going to make mistakes. You're going to learn a lot of lessons. It's, you know, it's definitely a learning process. But it is a lot of work. Managing fruit trees is a lot of work. There is a lot of pest and disease control associated with it. There is a lot of pruning associated with it. It is kind of high labor. You're getting up, you're pruning, you're cutting. We haven't gotten to thinning yet, but we're going to talk about thinning. You're harvesting, you're doing all of these things. Some of these pests, you almost have to control them the entire growing season. Codling moth is a really good example of that. Codling moth is your wormy apples and your wormy pears, right? And if you grow apples and pears, you will eventually have codling moth because it's just very, very, very prevalent in Utah. There's 2 to 3 generations of codling moth in a single growing season, depending on what happens weather-wise. So you're treating those trees throughout the growing season. And there are different options. Some of them are physical, where you can baggie your fruits to prevent that damage, that insect damage, or you can spray them. So there are different ways to do it, but yeah, you have to kind of be on it throughout the growing season. So I guess this is where I go to say that you do have decisions. And one decision could be that you say, you know what, this is just kind of a lot of work. And I think I'd rather buy my fruit from a fruit producer at the farmer's market, or, you know, a local fruit stand or something like that. There are those options as well. So yeah. Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, there's a couple questions that relate directly to what you were just talking about. So can apple trees be pruned into the vase form?
They can be pruned into the vase form. And they will do okay that way. What you do sometimes get, though, is you get sunburn injury on the apples. They just get a lot of light penetration, and they don't really handle it the same way that peaches and nectarines do, but they can be pruned to that form, and they'll be productive that way. Yeah.
Okay. And then one last question before we move on. It has to do with nut trees. Do they fall into one of these forms, tree nuts?
Oh, tree nuts. There's different forms for different types of tree nuts. And I, to be honest with you, am not familiar enough. We don't have a ton of nut production here. Things like walnuts get huge. We don't have a lot of almond production here. Some almonds can survive here, but it's questionable whether or not they're cold hardy here. We have a guide called Pruning the Orchard. So if you did a search, just USU Pruning the Orchard, you can pull up that publication and it will go up different. It will recommend different pruning for structures for nut trees. So I guess I would refer to that.
Sounds good. Yeah, we have a black walnut at the conservation garden, and it's not that old, but it's already pretty big. And we've just been pruning it like a standard ornamental tree, not really like a fruiting tree. So, but it's pretty big already.
Yeah.
So
yeah, some of the nut trees are huge trees, so you kind of have to know that going into it. So.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right. Okay, I'm going to move on. And again, if we need to get back to this form, we will. I really, really want to encourage people, though, please go look at that blog post, pull up those videos. I think it's really going to help you guys to see it because you'll get to see a before and after. The videos tend to kind of focus more on new or young fruit trees that you're pruning into shape and form, but you're going to be able to see that step by step better. And I think that's going to really, really help you understand what you should be doing when you're going out there and pruning. So. Okay.
Katie, what's the address for that again?
Organicforecast.org. You
Okay.
know, Sean, just go ahead and repopulate that in chat or whatever. Yep.
Sounds good.
Okay. What are you after? Can you make a few cuts to direct growth to get that form? Okay, so again, this is maybe a little bit of a better visual here. But here we're looking at peaches, plums, and apricots. We're going for this open vase form on these trees. We can see that we have this like about 36 inches off the ground here. We have selected our 3 to 4 main scaffolds here, okay? Moving outward in that nice kind of bowl or vase shape. And now we are doing that thinning cut to produce a outward. We're selecting a bud that is growing this direction to do our thinning cut, or sorry, heading cut at, so that we get our outward growth moving this way. And we're just really pushing those scaffolds out in a way to form that nice kind of bowl-shaped pattern. And anything, and there will be lots, trust me, anything that's trying to grow back into the interior portion of this tree gets pruned off. Remember, that's our summer pruning for peaches, plums, and apricots. And nectarines. Peaches and nectarines grow like crazy, folks. They put on a lot of growth in a single season. So you do a lot of pruning on those trees. You're removing a lot. Okay. And then another thing is that we talked about earlier that I just want to kind of hit home here is we know where the fruit is produced. We know that we have our 2 fruiting buds, right? Our fruit is produced on the outside, and then we have our thinner, straighter bud here in the middle, which is our vegetative. That's our leaf bud. Okay, so we know where the fruit is produced. And so we want to make sure, and it's going to be produced on year-old wood, so it's going to be towards the exterior portion of the tree here. Again, it has a little bit of a coloration difference. It's going to have that kind of orange cast to it, so you'll be able to kind of see that as well. But look for those bud patterns. You'll know exactly where the fruit buds are. We want to make sure that we shorten these tips down. So we do heading cuts here on the tips, okay? We're shortening those down so that the branches that we have left, they should be about the thickness of a pencil, that they're girthy enough to support the weight of those peaches and nectarines. And we'll talk about thinning. We'll talk about how many fruit you should leave in just a minute. But that's basically what we're looking at in terms of our pruning decisions, okay? Fruit is formed on 1-year wood. So the wood that was produced the previous year for peaches, plums, and apricots and nectarines, okay? Apricots and plums, we also have fruit formed on spurs. All right. Cherries, you can either do the modified central leader or you can do the open center or vase shaped. Most people are going to opt for the modified central leader for cherries, okay? But you can do it the open center and vase shape if you want. Fruit is formed on spurs and 2-year-old wood, and sometimes at the base of 1-year-old wood. Light is important for cherry bud formation, like everything else. Renew old branches by making. So this is something that Sheridan talked about. It's called blind wood. And sometimes what happens with cherries, the cherry trees that are under stress, sometimes the cherries will be born on, produced on wood, 1-year-old wood that does not produce leaves. This is an indication that the tree is stressed. And so you can do a renewal cut if you have that happening in a cherry tree, where you basically stub the branch 6 inches away from the main scaffold. And then you'll have this kind of, remember with our heading cuts, we get this flush of growth right underneath that pruning wood. And that this gives us more choices at this point in time that we can select from for the scaffolds that we want to, for the branches that we want to keep in that tree. So this is kind of more of if you're having issues with the stress tree and you need to regenerate growth, that's a technique for doing that. Okay, apples and pears, we're doing the modified central leader. Fruit is formed on spurs that are at least 2 years old. Really 2 to 4 year old spurs is when you start seeing fruit production on them. Okay, so I want to talk about thinning a little bit. You really should be thinning fruit off of your trees. It's really important. There's something that we have in apples and pears. We get a lot of questions about this at the extension office, called alternate year bearing. And this is when we have really heavy fruit production one year, and then the next year we don't really have much fruit production at all. And that is happening because the trees are not being thinned. Actually, interestingly enough, seed production, seed maturation in the tree is what tells that tree whether or not it is going to produce fruit the next year. And so if a tree has a year where it's produced the fruit's producing lots and lots of seeds, the tree hasn't been thinned, so there's lots of mature seeds on the tree. That's the indication to the tree that it doesn't need to produce as much or really any fruit that following year. Okay, so thinning is going to be your solution to prevent against alternate year bearing. Again, that's apples and pears. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to remove about at least 50% of the fruit before those seeds have a chance to mature in the fruit, so that the tree just knows every year, oh, I need to put on fruit growth. You really should thin your fruit. If you don't thin your fruit, if you have touching fruit, for example, if you had an apple touching an apple, that's a great point that we can get a lot of insect injury to that fruit. So that's a great point in which, for example, codling moth, we talked about just a little bit ago, there was the question, enters the fruit there. If you are not thinning your fruit, you'll very likely get smaller fruit. It may not color evenly. So you get a little less fruit, but you get much more high quality fruit. You deal with some of these issues revolving around insect damage, those sorts of things. And you prevent against that alternate year bearing by thinning your fruit. Again, that's apples and pears, although we do thin other fruits too, other types of fruit as well. Okay, so with peaches and nectarines, we want fruit every about 6 to 8 inches. Again, you don't want those peaches and nectarine touching one another. And remember what those buds look like, what those bud formations look like. So you remember how you had your 2 exterior fruiting buds, and then you had your single longer leaf bud in between. You are very likely going to have to take off one of those peaches or nectarines. You would not want to leave both of them, or you would for sure have those fruit that were touching. It's also just too heavy. It's too much weight. You're going to start to see some branches breaking in your tree if you don't remove some of that weight. So, for example, with peaches and nectarines, you probably want about 2 fruits per kind of your branch. Let's just say with those, let's say we want a fruit about every 6 to 8 inches is about right throughout the tree. Okay. Okay, apples and pears. This is a little bit confusing, and so I'm going to make it a little less confusing for you. But apples and pears, Sheridan says you thin back to the king fruits. You will have multiple blossoms coming out of the fruiting spurs. The first blossom to open and the largest is what's considered to be the king fruit. This is typically the one that you want to keep. However, you maybe a little bit of a more user-friendly thing to remember is that you want to, for apples and pears, you want to leave one fruit for every about 3 fruiting spurs. Is about right. Okay, so you're thinning back everything else. Again, when should I thin this fruit? When it is quarter sized or less. Once it gets to be about quarter sized, size of a quarter, it will start to produce seeds. And if you allow it to produce seeds, then your the tree is going to start potentially entering into this biennial or alternate year bearing cycle. Okay, so we want to thin apples and pears, leaving 1 fruit for every 3 spurs or so. Apricots, plums, and cherries are usually not thinned. Apricots do a pretty good job of thinning themselves because they bloom. Their blooms open so early in the season that oftentimes they're suspect to frost damage. And so a lot of people, unless you have a really good spot for an apricot tree, a lot of people don't get apricot production every year off their apricot tree because of the frost damage to the blooms. Okay. Any questions on that?
Let me see.
Everybody's given up and they got off the webinar.
We've still got like 130 people with us. So
okay. Awesome. Yeah. Not everybody.
Yeah, there's questions, but not specifically about the thinning. Probably some that we can wait to answer in the Q&A at the end.
Okay, this is awesome because I'm going to just kind of finish up and then I'll have a few extra things that I want to just hit on really quickly. And then I think we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. So we'll open it up then. Okay, so you never want to remove more than 1/3 of the wood in the tree at one time. I like Sheridan, as she says this, 1 person prunes, second opinions increase divorce rates. She's kind of funny that she and her husband both really like to prune fruit trees, and so she has certain trees that are her trees and her husband has certain trees that are his trees, and they just don't comment on each other's trees. But that really goes to the question earlier. They said, you know, this is it's hard to know that I'm making the right decision in my pruning choices and my pruning cuts, and this seems a little bit intimidating. You just have to practice and try. And these trees are pretty forgivable. And if you have 2 people pruning the same tree, the tree's probably going to get pruned different ways in the end, and that's okay. So there's no one correct choice. Sometimes you just kind of have to make decisions as you go along. But if you make mistakes, it's okay. The trees will grow back. And it does take a while to get it down. Be patient with yourself. She gave some resources here. We do have some nice fact sheets that go into detail at the USU site. So detailed peach pruning, detailed apple pruning, and pruning overall. So let's see. With that, I just had, let me see if I missed anything before we open it up for questions. One thing I did want to talk about, because I suspect it will come up for some of you, is that a lot of people ask if they should be fertilizing their fruit trees. And what you should definitely do, I know a lot of you probably already have fruit trees in the ground and you're growing them. If you have not planted your fruit trees yet, you want to make sure that you amend your site well. And you spend some time on site amendment, that you're putting a high quality compost or something like that into the area where you're planning on planting your fruit tree. Doing a really good job amending the soil can help alleviate the need for a lot of fertilization down the road. The nutrients that tend to be most deficient for fruit production are nitrogen, zinc, and iron are the top three. Zinc and iron are both micronutrients. Plants need them in very, very tiny quantities, but they can be deficient in our soils. It has to do with our soil chemistry, the pH of our soil. They're there, they're just in forms in which plants can't take them up, they can't utilize them. So we do see those deficiencies pop up sometime. But nitrogen is the other one that sometimes we see with production. But if you do amend the soil, you also probably want to get a soil test done, just get a baseline of what you have plenty of and what you could use more of in your soil prior to planting your trees. But in terms of fertilization, we go off of whether or not we're seeing adequate growth, yearly growth out of the trees. And if you're seeing adequate yearly growth, then you really don't need to be adding fertilizers to your trees on an annual basis. And I can go over those. I mean, don't worry about this too much, and you could always contact us and get this again as well. But if somebody has a pen and paper and they really have a burning desire to know what we're talking about, we're talking young trees that are less than 6 years, and then bearing trees which are older than 6 years old. For apple, for a young tree, you should get about 10 to 12 inches of annual growth. For a bearing tree, you should get about 4 to 8 inches. For peach, nectarine, and apricot, you should get about 10 to 24 inches of annual growth for a young tree, about 8 to 15 inches for a bearing tree, so older than 6 years. And sour cherry and plum, you should get about 10 to 12 inches of annual growth for a young tree, and then 8 to 12 inches for a bearing or older tree, older than 6 years old. Okay, so that's a little bit on fertilizer. You really, the other thing I want to point out too, just in terms of fruit tree care, since we have the time, fruit trees require a lot of water. They require a lot of light exposure, so you have to place them in a place where they're going to get that. In the landscape, they also require quite a bit of water, so making sure that you have adequate irrigation. Definitely, if you have a drought-stressed tree, it's going to impact your fruit production. So you do need to be managing that as well. And then I just, want to also make a comment, because we have a little bit of time. Again, if you've already purchased a tree, then that's okay. But if you haven't yet, in particular, when we're looking at apples and cherries, your rootstock. So typically a fruit tree is the fruiting portion is a variety of tree that is grafted onto a rootstock. So you might have an apple rootstock, but that apple rootstock is different. You have a graft of a different apple that is the actual bearing portion of the tree up in the canopy. So it's two apples that are grafted onto one plant. And rootstocks, and in particular in apples and cherries, are really helpful because it can really help with size control. These actually started getting generated and commercially available back in the 1950s. So if you have a really, really old fruit tree, chances are that you're not looking at a tree that has a dwarfing rootstock. But after that, we started to see those be commercially available. So, I mean, just to give you an idea, and I want to go back to my notes here. A semi-dwarf apple, for example, you might be looking at a tree that's about 15 to 20 feet tall. Or if you had a dwarf peach, you might be looking at a tree that's about 6 to 10 feet tall. So just to kind of give you an idea as you're shopping around. But I guess where I'm going with this as well is you need to make sure you have adequate spacing for those trees in the landscape. They kind of need to be standing out on their own. They obviously need light penetration coming from all directions to get adequate fruit production. So for a semi-dwarf apple, you're going to need spacing for that, at least 12 to 15 feet. For a dwarf apple, 6 to 10 feet. For a pear, 12 to 18 feet. Apricot, 10 to 15 feet. Peach, 8 to 12 feet. Plum, 10 to 12 feet. Sweet cherry, 15 to 18 feet. And tart cherry, 10 to 12 feet. So you don't want to crowd these plants too much, or that's going to have implications on your fruit production as well. So I think with that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to questions and answer. And thanks for any of you that want to go ahead and leave us now. I appreciate your time and interest, and good luck.
All right. Thanks for the presentation, Katie. Lots of good information there. We've got some questions that have come in. Um, Here's the first one. Should I leave the main leader? Oh, whoops. Should I leave the main leader if, sorry, the Q&A keeps moving on me, so I start reading it and then it moves. 1 second. Should I leave the main leader if I want taller trees so the deer don't eat my fruit? Remove lower scaffolds as the tree grows? Question mark.
Yeah, that could definitely be an application where you might desire having most people don't want their fruit production up in a portion of the tree where they have to get on a ladder to go access it. Also remember with fruit production, and it may be also, I mean, some people make that decision as well, that maybe they have an apple tree, and really they only want like 50 apples out of that tree every year. Then you might be able to, for example, baggy those 50 apples to prevent against calling moth, and you really not worry about the rest of the fruit that's in the tree, just kind of whatever happens to it, and pull that off. And in that particular type of a situation, it could make sense to have your fruit production and, up in the tree where the deer can't reach it. But just with fruit production, it's tricky because again, this is for optimal fruit production, but you have to prune your trees. You have to somehow manage pest control in your trees. You have to thin your trees. You have to harvest your trees. And so that's a lot of work on a ladder up in the air. So that's just a consideration that you might want to make. But yeah, I could see that working if that was something that you were willing to do.
Okay, and I just add to that, we have a family of deer that live on site at our garden. And one thing that we have to do with our young trees, fruit trees, and just ornamental trees in general, is we usually cage them for the first few years, because most of the damage that we get from deer is them actually just breaking the tree in half, which we've had happen before. But we cage our new trees for 3 or 4 years, which seems to help. Let's see. I have a 10-year-old peach tree. Do you recommend I cut off the central leader if it's not a vase shape already?
Again, that is a regeneration of a mature tree. That is kind of your decision as to whether or not you want to try to take that on. That tree is going to continue getting taller. So if you don't want it to continue to get taller, then yeah, you're going to have to start doing some height reduction on that central leader. Remember, you're not taking off more than 1/3 of the wood in a single year. So that might have to be a multiple year strategy of reducing that height. But if you are not really worried about the tree getting big and your ultimate goal isn't, maximum fruit production, and you like the shape and look of the tree, you could totally leave it like that too. So that's kind of one of those where you have to make that decision. I just want to say, because I knew we would come back to this, because a lot of time we do get a lot of questions on this with fruit tree pruning. Mature fruit trees that were not pruned early in the stages for, form, height control, it's hard. It's hard to bring those back. It really is best if you can work with a young tree. So sometimes there are harder decisions to make with those types of trees. And I totally get that, just because it's a fruit tree, it can also just be a really beautiful landscape tree as well. And so the tree, I can tell you this, if you did try to reduce the height of it, of a mature peach tree, you would get water sprouting like crazy. So you would be doing a ton of control in terms of trying to manage water sprouts. Probably would be best if you could try to pick those off as much as possible, as opposed to, cutting all over the tree, but sometimes that's not doable either. But anyway, you just have to know that you're going to get a growth response out of making that cut. Then it's whether or not you want to take that on and manage that, or if you kind of like the tree the way it is, and that's okay too.
All right. Should we use some kind of dormant horticultural spray in the winter time to help prevent disease, insect damage, etc.?
So dormant horticulture sprays are used for some things, but they're not going to work for all pests. And it's usually an insect pest. We'll use them for things like scale and some of those different sorts of things. So for that particular question, I would really, I'm not just trying to push this off. I think this is an absolutely necessary step that you go to utahpests.usu.edu. Whatever type of fruit tree you're growing, apple, pear, peach, plum, whatever, you look at what that particular type of fruit tree is particularly susceptible to, and then it will show you the different controls. I also thank you for asking that question, because I forgot to mention this earlier, and this is really important. The other function or feature that they have on that site, which I highly encourage, especially with tree fruit production, that everybody take advantage of, they have what they call Ipm Pest Advisories. We quite literally have one of the very best integrated pest management teams in the entire country. I will sometimes go to national conferences and talk to colleagues from other parts of the country, and they go, "Oh, you have the Utah Pest team. They are amazing." So they are out there putting out all this information for us, for our state, and they do an amazing job. They're incredible. So I really think everybody should utilize them. And they, on their utahpest.usu.edu, they have a function called Ipm Pest Advisories. And you put your email in. They don't give your email out to anybody else. They just use it, but they'll send you advisories. And so they'll give you that critical timing. They'll say, codling moth has been caught in our traps, and this city and this city and this city in Utah. And to avoid codling moth injury of apples and pears, your wormy apples and pears, you need to keep your fruit treated between this calendar day and this calendar day. And here are the different things that you can use. Sometimes dormant oils are suggested for some of those things, and other things they don't work. And the thing about it is that I unfortunately can't give you a date and time that you should be on alert, or you should treat your trees for different types of insect pests and diseases, and in particular insect pests, because their metabolism is based off of ambient air temperature. And obviously there's variability in that from year to year. So what happens is that our Utah Pest team has traps set up around the state, constantly monitoring those traps. And when they start to see evidence of some of these insect pests, they send these out as alerts in these pest advisories. And then they tell us, when we have to keep our fruit treated, what we can use. They will give both organic and non-organic control options. And so if you have a preference one way or the other, you can use the one that you would like to use. So it's an incredible service. So sign up for those, and then also really explore that site. Look at the different insect pests and diseases that are typical for the type of fruit that you're trying to grow, and what's recommended for control for it. That was very long-winded, but I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's going to change everything.
All right, we'll do one more question here before we wrap up, but it's a good one. Apples and pears require another similar or different tree for pollination, correct?
Okay, cross-pollination. Yeah. So yes, apples and pears, it depends. Apples require a cross-pollination. You can pull up pollination charts. They're really easy to find if you just do a general Google search and go apple pollination chart. You'll pull up a chart, and it will show you what pollinates what. Okay, so not all apples will, even if they're of different varieties, they may not pollinate each other. So it will tell you what does pollinate what. But apples, yes. Let's see. Pears, Anjou and Bartlett are partially self-fruitful. although cross-pollination will improve cropping. Apricots are self-fruitful. There are some types, Revival, Roland, and Rival require cross-pollination. Plums, some plums, like Stanley and Damson, are self-fruitful. Others require or do better with cross-pollination. European varieties require other European varieties as cross-pollinators. Likewise, Japanese plums need pollen from a different Japanese variety. Tart cherries, the common one you see is the morsery. Those are your sour cherries, your pie cherries. Those are self-fruitful, so those do not require a cross-pollinator. And with sweet cherries, Stella and Lapins are self-fruitful. Bing, Lambert, and Royal Anne require a cross-pollinator. So some of them do, some of them don't. Hopefully that answered your question. That was an excellent question. And again, if you're like, whoa, I didn't get all that. Whoa, I don't understand what she's saying. Cross-pollination. Email us, mastergardener@usu.edu. We'll help walk you through it.
All right, sounds great. Thanks, Katie. And thanks again for the 2 presentations today. Lots of good comments in the chat box telling you thank you. So,
yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Good luck.